So I think the first thing we need to do is just to read it through and refresh our minds on what we read last time, okay? Last time we did part of the meaning of the vision, but we didn't finish off some of the other details that were in the chapter. So tonight we'll finish those off with God's help. Okay, so chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary, and of the host that will be trampled underfoot?" He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future." I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So last time we looked at it, you should know by now, the statue in chapter 2, it was Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the 10-toed kingdom, which represented what came after the Roman Empire. And then you see beasts again in chapter 7, but in chapter 8 it's specific about what these beasts actually represent, yes? The ram represents Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire, which came after the Babylonian Empire. And then the goat, the shaggy goat, with the one prominent horn, which is Alexander the Great, represents the Greek Empire. We looked at that. So the Greek Empire, with Alexander, they attacked the Persians, they overcame the Persians, and they established the Greek Empire, where the Persian Empire had been. And Alexander even made the capital of the Greek Empire, Babylon, rather than some other city in the west. Alexander died when he was still very young, and there was a succession of wars amongst his generals after he died, and then eventually, after a few years, out of that political mess came four separate parts of the Greek Empire, which we looked at. It's in your notes, it's on that map, that coloured map, and you can see the Greek Empire split into 4 parts. And there was some feuding and some warring between those, and those 4 eventually became the 2 that are called the King of the North and the King of the South, which are in chapter 11. And in some ways, chapter 11 represents a continuation of chapter 8. But before we get lost in the detail of chapter 11, we need just to finish off what we were talking about in chapter 8. Well, in chapter 2, if you remember, we see the vision of the statue: gold, silver, bronze, iron and clay. Yeah? That's Babylon, Greece, Persia, and so on. We've seen that many times. That should be transfixed on our mind by now. We should know that inside out. Yes, the four empires which were in chapter 2. So if you'll excuse my drawing, there's your statue with 10 toes. Yeah, there you've got Babylon. Here you've got the Medo-Persian Empire. Then you've got the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire, and then so on what came after that. And the ones that we're talking about in chapter 8 are the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. But the emphasis is not so much on the Medo-Persian Empire, it's not on the ram. The emphasis is actually on the goat, yes? So in chapter 8 it starts to talk about the ram, and it just sets the scene of the ram moving this way, and this way to set up his empire, and he can do what he will, and he can rule freely, and so on and so forth. But then the emphasis comes in when it starts to talk about the goat, the four-horned goat that represents Greece. So the emphasis in chapter 8 isn't so much on the ram here, it's on the goat and what happens in the time of the goat empire, yes? So the ram's there just to set the scene, then the goat comes on the scene with his one prominent horn, which is Alexander the Great. He moves against Darius III, I think it was, of Persia, and he defeats him in battle. And if you've seen the film about Alexander's life, you'll know the kind of battle scene that was at the beginning of that film that tells this story. And then the goat takes over, the Greek Empire gets established. But in chapters 2, this is chapter 2, all we're talking about is empires. Empires that rule this part of the world, yes? And of course it's talking about the times of the Gentiles, so that's from about 607 BC onwards, when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Israel, took Jerusalem, and took the first part of the exiles back to Babylon. But all we've seen is empires. And like I said last time, what you've got in chapter 8 the emphasis on chapter 8 now comes onto a person, and it's the first time we've seen this in the book of Daniel. All we've talked about before were empires and beasts with horns or wings or something of that nature, but we haven't actually talked about a person. And in chapter 8 that happens for the first time. And we can see that if we just go back to chapter 8, in verse 9, again it talks about it in terms of horns. Okay, out of one of these four parts of the Greek Empire, the Seleucid Empire, came another horn which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land, which is Israel, of course. So it talks about this person in terms of it being a horn, but then when the interpretation comes a bit later in verse 23, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king will arise. And that's the first time a human, or the explanation is given in terms of a human being. Yes? This stern-faced king, and his name in history was Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. He was the fourth king called Antiochus in the line of emperors, the line of kings that ruled in the Seleucid Greek Empire, which was in the area of what we now call Syria, over into Iraq and so on. And he called himself, they all seem to call themselves by names, and this man called himself by the name Epiphanes. There was one other king, for example, that called himself by the name Theos, which means God. This man called himself Epiphanes, which means glorious. So it's Antiochus the Glorious, yes? It's also a word that's used to represent the incarnation of a god in human form in the Greek language. So that may have been part of it himself, that he saw himself as being God, with a small g. But he was an evil man, and he is the man that represents in history the person that we call the Antichrist, who will appear before Jesus comes back. Yes? So when you look at this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, and you see what he was like, what he did in particular, and what happened to the Jews and to Jerusalem and to the temple under his reign, then that's the type that you've got to see, you've got to understand. That's the kind of thing that's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation when the Antichrist rises up. Yeah? So if you like, Antiochus Epiphanes is the Antichrist in the Old Testament. Yes? He's the type of the one who will come later on. And we looked at him and we saw what he did. I'll just read these facts out. Here we are. He's an evil, contemptible man. His reign's characterized by murder, political intrigue, pillage, theft, immorality, and so on. Beginning in the mid to late 170s BC, Antiochus began to persecute the Jews and attempted to violently stamp out their religion in his attempts to Hellenize the culture of the whole region and to introduce the worship of Greek gods. He outlawed the worship of Yahweh on pain of death, so the Jews couldn't worship Yahweh. He killed Ananias, the high priest in Jerusalem. He pillaged the wealth of the Jewish temple, took it all away. He outlawed circumcision. He killed 40,000 Jews and sold a similar number into slavery. And he then had a war in Egypt, which he lost. And he, on his way back, he savagely attacked the Jews. The Jews became his scapegoat for his anger. And he took it all out on them. He forbade the Jews to worship and to sacrifice. And this is what he did. He desecrated the temple in Jerusalem by erecting a statue of Zeus or Jupiter in the temple. And this is the thing that's called the abomination of desolation, that's referred to in chapter 11 verse 31, which we'll see later on tonight. And that's a prophetic type of the Antichrist's own abomination, which will be set up in the time of the tribulation, that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 15. The Jews that went to make sacrifice were forced to make sacrifices at the feet of an idol which was made in the form of Antiochus, as though he himself were God. And these are some of the facts. On the 15th of the month of Kislev, the Hebrew month Kislev, that's December the 25th in our Gregorian calendar, no relation to Christmas at all, that's just a coincidence. On the 15th of Kislev in 167 BC, a Jewish priest named Mattathias revolted to what was going on by killing a Hellenized Jewish priest who was about to sacrifice a female pig on the altar, which of course was anathema to the Jews. This began a revolt which was later led by his son Judas Maccabeus, who fought back against Antiochus. Judea was eventually liberated and the temple was rededicated again on the 25th of Kislev in 164 BC, that's 3 years later. And the history of that is recounted in the books of 1 and 2 Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha. That all shows that the emphasis here, the emphasis in Daniel 8, is not so much on the empires, and again, it's not so much on this person of Antiochus, it's on the land of Israel, it's on the Jews, it's on the city of Jerusalem, and in Antiochus's case, certainly, it's on the temple. Those are the 4 things which are in focus in the book of Daniel. And again, I've mentioned it several times, but if you read the book of Daniel, excuse me, it's very easy to get lost in the detail of empires, gold, silver, bronze, Rome, Greece, Medo-Persia, all the rest of it, Babylon. And it's easy to lose your focus on those 4 things: the land of Israel, the Jews, the city, and the temple. The book of Daniel begins around 607 BC when Nebuchadnezzar comes where? To Jerusalem and besieges it and takes the people or part of them away from the land, away from Israel. He besieges the city. The city eventually falls, and about 19 years later he actually destroys the city and destroys the temple itself. That's Nebuchadnezzar. So again, the focus is not on the empire, the focus is in what the empire does to the people of God. And you see, that's the same kind of emphasis that you've got in the book of Revelation when the Antichrist comes up. He's given power over the people of God, over the saints, for 3 years and a half, for 42 months, for 1,260 days, yes, and so on. That's in the book of Revelation. So the same emphasis is here. So if you're going to get a good understanding of the book of Daniel, remember all the way through, it's not so much about the Gentile empires, it's about the times of the Gentiles, which were visited upon the people, the city and the temple, and so on, and the land, from this time on until the city and the temple area were eventually liberated. And we saw from chapter 4, I think it was, that these times of the Gentiles last for 2,520 years. Yes, that's 7 times 360. Yes, 7 prophetic, 2,520 prophetic years. And that eventually ends, of course, when? Can anybody remember?
1948.
It was in 1948, because we exclude the 34 years of the life of Jesus. And that's the bit that Grattan Guinness and the people in the 19th century hadn't worked out. They worked out a lot of detail, and they kept on coming up with the date of 1917, which did prove to be very significant, so they were right. But the later dates, they didn't get those dates. And so we'll come back to that one a little bit later tonight. I want to go